Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Austin, and I am speaking with you from the bottom of Doucette Hall, right next to the Bruce Gallery on the campus of Edinburgh University. I'm here to welcome you today to the Mini SX, and this is the second panel of the day. We have 3 artist educators who are going to share their work with you. Just a minute, I want to share with you about Sculpture X itself. It's an organization that was founded in 2010, and it's a teaching and networking platform. And it's really designed to catalyze collaborations like this among teaching and arts institutions. We normally do face-to-face events, and we've had a number of, over the last 10 years, symposium and involved all numbers of institutions, including Allegheny College, Chatham University, Edinburgh, of course, Seton Hill, Slippery Rock, University of Pittsburgh, and the Sculpture Center, which is actually housing the fiscal end of our organization. And the other organization that's been involved with this is Civitas. Now, those are only some of the many universities and institutions that have been involved. And I'm really excited to encourage you to mark your calendar for September 16th through the 18th of this year, when we're going to be having Sculpture X face-to-face in Pittsburgh and Greensburg, and we'll have the opportunity to have professional level and student shows, exhibitions, and also workshops and panel discussions. So we're really looking for you to participate with us in September. And today, I'm really happy to introduce the 3 speakers very briefly. Dietrich Wegner. He is my colleague here at Edinburgh University, where he is the assistant chair of the art department. Patty Beachley is at Seton Hill University, where she chairs the art department. And James Lukes is a professor at Chatham, I'm sorry, not Chatham, but yes, Chatham. Chatham is correct, Chatham, also in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So with that, I turn it over to you, Patty.
I believe Dietrich's headed first, right?
And you're totally right. I made that one an error. Dietrich, please take over.
All right. Hi, I'm Dietrich Wegner. At first glance, it might be hard to see what sticks all these seemingly disparate works together. I'm hoping to lead you to the through line of all my work. Our reality is not so much shaped by the world around us as much as by our perception of the way things are. This has perhaps never been more apparent than during the last 4 years, when half of America seems as though they live in one reality and the other half in a completely different one. Of course, there are many more than 2 American experiences. I was born in Australia to American parents. When I was 3 months old, we moved to Bayad, a village in Egypt, south of Cairo. I grew up in communal living with the other people in the humanitarian organization known as the ICA. When I was 4, the ICA stationed us in Houston's 3rd Ward. From this point forward, I grew up with a window into 2 radically different Americas. My home rested in the middle of a poor Black neighborhood, but I went to public school filled with mostly middle to upper middle class white kids. I got a window into these 2 Americas, but I wasn't really part of either one. The idea of dual perception surfaced in my work as I reacted to our nation invading Iraq after 9/11. My fellow Americans' reaction to the Muslim world frightened me, so I tried to make an image that broke down the barrier of the other by making a suicide bomber in white skin, vulnerable and scared, in hopes that empathy would lead to a space of reflection. As a child, I was often read Shel Silverstein's Giving Tree. It is a book that I have always remembered to be about an unhealthy relationship between a boy and his first best friend, a tree. At first, they have a co-equal relationship. They both freely give love and receive love. However, eventually the tree is left with pretty much nothing. Now here's the catch. This is how I remember the book ending. And the tree was happy, but not really. The problem is, I look back as an adult, and that's not how the book ends. This is how the book ends. And the tree was happy. I guess I filled in the part about not really. Now, does that say more about me, or was that implied by Shel Silverstein? I did this drawing in response to the unequal and, in my mind, unhealthy relationship I saw us having with our military. We often look to use force and our military to provide a safety and security that I do not see it being able to provide in perpetuity. There is something unbalanced between what we give and what we expect to receive when it comes to how our nation uses military force. As I do view myself a sculptor, I wanted to make something physical, so I started drawing ideas for a form that would somehow smash together opposing images. I wanted something both playful and destructive, beautiful and repulsive, real and imaginary. Many versions of my playhouse followed. This is probably installation number 30 or something like that. It has an adjustable steel armature that allows me to vary its height to the space and vary its form, so it really is a new piece with every installation. This installation was in England at Banksy's Disneyland in 2015. Playhouse can go from 20 feet high to 8 feet at its lowest. The Disneyland version was 16 feet high, and this one at the Leopold Museum in Vienna is 14 feet high. This show was a pretty cool clouds retrospective that mixed contemporary work with old masters. Here is one of the early installations from 2008, on the left, mixed with some process installation shots from the first ever installation on the right. After Playhouse, I wanted to continue with imagery that captured contradictions, using duality to mash together disparate emotions in images. Well, what I just described is my general mode of working in any artwork. The particular focus of this body of work, Cumulus Brand, is a meditation on how our identities evolve and how we shape them. Do corporations manipulate and mold us to gain profit? Yes, but we also use the products we buy, the organizations we belong to express our identities as well. These sculptures were sculpted in clay. I then molded in a silicone mold with plaster mother mold, cast in silicone with a uniform color, airbrushed with thin silicone to create varied skin pigmentation. I then used an airbrush to spray through hand-cut stencils to create the logos. There are 3 different sculptures on my website and a photographic series as well. In the photographs, I used Photoshop to put the logos on the kids. For each piece, the logos were determined through an interview process with the parents in an attempt to capture the identity of one or both parents through a sort of logo portrait. While the images I am including in this PechaKucha are fairly limited, and I have bodies of work beyond what I am showing here, I thought it important to show more drawing, painting, and photography. While I mostly use my 2D disciplines to get out and work through my ideas, I also view them as works unto themselves. In Studies in Solitude, I investigate the perplexity of a cloud displaced into our terrestrial world. Maybe a bit lost, confused, and migratory, I'm really interested in an image not being what it seems, and also it not being a very convincing lie. My tattoo baby sculptures are no Ron Mueck piece. I'm not that convincing in my craft. They are crafted somewhere between hyperrealism and a child's doll. While this is somewhat a product of my technical ability, it is also a choice. I like the idea of the lie being a little visible, the material revealing itself a bit. These cloud sculptures are trying to be clouds, but they aren't quite succeeding. They end up being something else, another entity entirely. Our perception of an object or a situation isn't always right. While we should always try to get towards an objective truth, I'm not sure we can ever entirely succeed. I really like creating an image that doesn't quite get there, one that smashes opposing perceptions together and intertwines them. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed my work.
All right. So that's my presentation. Anybody have any questions?
So I'm encouraging people who do have questions who are in the audience to go ahead and put them in the Q&A or put them in the chat, either way. And anyone else on the panel is free to unmute themselves and also engage in a short Q&A here.
I'd like to make a comment about your work, Dietrich. I think
Okay.
it's important that, to me, that when we're looking at the photos of the sculptural clouds in the terrestrial environments, that we do understand that it isn't a real cloud or a photoshopped cloud in there. And so I think that's a significant thing, considering how much we can manipulate photography, that this is a real object out in space, and you can definitely feel the weight of it more so because of how it's constructed there. How do you get them suspended in position? And if you could speak a little bit more about like revealing their materiality and how that's significant.
Right. Yeah. So before I answer the suspension one of the things I had to cut out because of the PechaKucha format, because it's so brief, was that series started as a photoshopped photographic series where I shot clouds in the sky and then photoshopped them into the woods. And I instantly loved the image, but and I showed them as 4x8 photographs. But I just didn't love the photographic illusion, especially with how ubiquitous Photoshop is in our culture. And so I sort of sat on it for a while, and then I made the sculptural series that I showed. And what I love about them, the sculptures versus the Photoshopped images, was, I mean, it's not a cloud when you look at it. For one thing, the light is right because it's actually in the space, whereas the Photoshopped cloud put in the woods, the light was never right because the clouds were up in the sky. But also a cloud is clearly not made of solid matter, but my sculptures are. So there's something that happens there that I think is really interesting. They're suspended, there's a horizontal cable above the frame of the camera. And there's a pulley on that has one vertical cable that comes down that holds it. And then there's a crank inside the cloud. And the whole cloud is probably like 9,900 pounds. It's pretty heavy. And each cloud is about a 3-month project. So, and they can't get wet. So they're tarped when I'm not there. There's a whole ordeal there with that. And it's made for the photograph. So it's one-sided. But I thought it was really important that I didn't use Photoshop. The first one I did, I got up on a ladder and I painted out the cable like with camo. So whatever color was behind the cable, I painted it. And I successfully got rid of the cable, but almost died in the process because I'm really high in the air. So after that one piece installation, I did use Photoshop on the cable to ensure that my kids would have a father moving forward.
Thank you. I see 2 questions have arrived in the Q&A. The first is from Melanie Lansettle, who actually ran or co-organized the Emerging Artists that we just had at 11 a.m. She asks you, Dietrich, how do you see your work in conversation with the idea of postmodern hyperspace? And I think EX is an example, the clouds or the babies with tattoos. How do you see the work transcending that?
I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not familiar with the term postmodern hyperspace. Can someone give me a short definition of what that refers to? Does any
4 faculty who have no idea. So Melanie, could you school us on that with another, like, put it in the question then we'll go back to your question. Meanwhile, we'll jump to Evan's question. After years of maybe not reading or hearing about the Giving Tree, how did you make that connection to mushroom clouds? And also, would you comment on the violent nature of the US military? And again, these questions are coming from Evan Huey.
So I think I didn't have as many books and toys as a lot of kids did because I grew up, my early childhood was in the developing world. And then even when we came to America, we just didn't have a lot of stuff. I think we also have more stuff as a culture now than we did, 40 years ago. So the few things I did have really stuck out. And, we had a small amount of books and a lot of them were Shel Silverstein poems and kids' books. And And my parents are really reflective people, so they only had really interesting kids books, none of which were, they were all really layered. So they all kind of left an impact on me. So they also just, the mushroom cloud looks like a tree, you know, I mean, that, especially that one that I drew on top of. So I think that's one of the things that connected it. But it was just an iconic book in my childhood, and I can't remember more than that, but I think just the fact that it looked like a tree reminded me of the Giving Tree. I mean, I looked at hundreds of images of mushroom clouds before I arrived at that one, but many of them are tree-like. And I'm not so much commenting on the violent nature of the US military as much as the US population's use of the US military. Like, I'm actually not criticizing the US military, I'm criticizing what we expect out of it. We expect it to solve problems that I don't think it can solve. And that's not the fault of the US military, that's the fault of us who sends it out to do things that that just aren't really achievable. And I think it's proven to be that way since we've been at war and haven't accomplished a whole lot, you know, decades later.
All right, I'm going to return to Melanie's question then. And by the way, I looked up postmodern hyperspace, and I'm getting images of a Roland Barthes diagram and a Pokemon battle chart. And so what Melanie says is that it is the idea that postmodernist work creates an alternate realities that can exist in our realities, pull out of them, and it becomes kind of warping in a critical way. And then she follows up with saying it's commonly connected to architecture, but is thought about also with installations, which create semi-warping realities. And we had a commentator, another comment from Ron Blevins, that Pokemon is art. And so I want to go back to Melanie's original question here, which is, how do you see your work in conversation with the idea of postmodern hyperspace, and especially about the your clouds and the babies with that tattoos? So again, sort of alternating realities or alternate.
Yeah, so I'll somewhat relate to that, but also, I mean, for all of human history, I mean, we live in a world and we have a perception of that world that doesn't necessarily match someone else's perception, right? That's existed forever. You're in a conversation with somebody, you reflect later on that conversation, and you think it was about one thing, they tell you later, no, it was about this. So there's always differences of perception, and there always has been. But I think in addition to that, ever since our worlds get more and more digital, and algorithms surround us that kind of create a world for us of information and constantly surround us more by really what we're already interested in. We have pockets of society that exist in separate realities or perceive reality to be very different than it was in a whole new way, just created by our digital interfaces, which isn't exactly what you were commenting on, but that work originated, the clouds work originated before I was really thinking about the sort of different realities created by our, you know, the way we isolate ourselves online in particular. But I think more about that. I mean, the fact that we just had a whole bunch of people go into the Capitol and because they had a whole different perception of what America they live in, and, you know, whether it was a rigged election or not a rigged election. That's more what I think about in relationship to my work, at least moving forward, rather than I think what Melanie was commenting on.
Thank you, Dietrich. And we're now going to ask Patty to take over the screen and share her presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Patty Beachley. I'm Chair of Art and Design at Seton Hill University. And I have my Instagram there at Patina DeVille, which is Patina the city or Pat in the City. So that was kind of the impetus behind that. And then my website's right there too, pattybeachley.com. Hold on here. Okay, so I've been casting metal for over 30 years now. And initially I was attracted to metal casting because I wanted to break into the boys club as an undergrad because it was heavily male influenced. This particular series of work is called 16 Yarns. And it is cast phrases that are sourced from the TV reality show 16 and Pregnant. So with this grouping of work, I initially was interested in sourcing it from a place that wasn't kind of myself. This is a person underneath of it. I've been hanging them a little bit higher because they kind of have turned into this selfie sculpture, so to speak. This particular one is chromed yarn, though we never even talk anymore. This one's called I Made You a Mother. And this is cast aluminum yarn. So it was also kind of a technical challenge to do. So I make it by dipping yarn in wax, and then I lay it on out in the text and do a lost wax casting with it. So this is, the meaning of this kind of changes depending on who's saying the phrase. So if it's a spouse or a child, etc. So besides yarn, I also cast carpet. And initially when I was doing this type of work, I was actually using carpet and incorporating castings into the work. But then I started actually casting the carpet. The use of carpet in my work is a conceit for Carpet Muncher. I am a non-binary queer artist. On this particular piece, this is a detail of the word mother, and that's the cast yarn that's been welded onto the surface of the cast aluminum carpet. The text that's incorporated on these carpet pieces, I kind of see it as like a graffiti on the surface. And so this one's kind of written backwards in mirror image, hold. And then I incorporate these found wood chunks, and they're actually used in the mold in order to get this kind of gestural shape of the carpet, and they're cast in sand molds. This one has a yarn word attached to it, loved. And it's actually an interactive piece where I invited viewers to graffiti on the surface with paint pens in order to deface the work, kind of like I deface it myself. And then this is a smaller cast card piece hoe, and it's coated with this colored waxy lipstick finish. So this is kind of, you can see like the level of detail and kind of the scale of the yarn words. And so I often use words that are kind of gendered, like the idea of slut shaming by calling someone hoe. And then this is a work in progress piece. I've since finished it, but you can see it has the yarn word candy arm welded to the surface there. And then I have this conical shape with the wood kind of jutting on through. So I'm interested in these words that have some sort of gendered reference. So this idea of tender, and these are rope castings, this next series, and they're also coated with this waxy lipstick finish. And then here's a rope version of Candy Arm. So the idea with Candy Arm is that it's like throw like a girl, but if you reverse it, it's like arm candy. So it kind of helps us examine the language we use and how it affects our thinking and the meaning. This one's called Passing, and the shadow is important to the work. They kind of are mounted maybe about 3 to 4 inches off the wall. So passing is a term used for like a man passing for a woman or a woman passing for a man, etc. And so the use of like the lipstick wax finish on the surface is in order to index the mouth or speaking, which, that's where a text can come from, or parole. This is a larger casting. It's cast iron. I made this right during the Kavanaugh hearings. So that was like 2019 of fall. And what was going on at the time and how I choose some of the words is sometimes something meets up in my personal life, and then there's something going on in the news and it kind of comes together and I'm like, yes, liar, that's the next word. So this is just a close-up where you can see the texture and how I've applied the wax finish on there. So this is obviously Hustler, and this is another cast iron piece out of rope. Hustler can be a good thing if it's a guy. He's hustling, he's doing work, he's trying to make a buck. But if it's a woman, it kind of switches the tone of it somewhat. And then with man down, man up is kind of a phrase like man up, like everybody should man up and be a man kind of thing. But I think a lot of my work mixes some masculine and feminine characteristics, because here you have this cast metal, but then it's made out of fibers. And then also within the word choice, there's a level of playfulness and sometimes humor, and sometimes revisiting what these things mean to us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then if anybody has any questions.
I don't see any yet, so that usually takes a minute here, but I just want to ask one of my own, and that is, it's really a technical one about the surfacing with something as seemingly fragile as lipstick and wax. Is there some parameters for display? Like, do you have to make sure it doesn't get too hot? Could they melt, or are they stabilized in some way?
Yeah, they're all coated. I usually use a type of picture varnish, a gloss picture varnish, to coat them. And really, it's a real thin surface layer of it. So I guess you could stick a hot light on it and melt it if you wanted to, but I don't think that would happen really. So, and these are colors that I'll mix together in a pot, and then I'll apply it on the surface, and I'll work it across the surface and use a heat gun and then reapply in order to get the particular surface that I'm going for.
Okay, thank you. Ron Blevins asks, as a non-binary person, does the gendered nature of your art have a place for someone not a part of the binary?
So I'm not sure I understand what's meant by not part of the binary on, because I mean, we're all part of the binary because we live in a binary culture. It's only starting to be, we're only starting to have the language of that, I would say, in the past 5 years or so, as part of kind of, I remember when Facebook, like all of a sudden you could identify 52 different ways of identifying your gender on Facebook, but that wasn't too long ago that was something that you could do. So I don't feel like we live in a culture that is out of the binary yet, if that's what you're asking. Does that seem like what's being asked, or?
I'm not actually, I'm hoping that they'll follow up with another question here because I'm not really certain.
Okay.
How long have you been using language in the work?
I would say it first started off with the first thing I made in graduate school. And I made this, and you might have actually been at my first critique, Lisa, I believe, at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I made this kind of giant bronze potato that said, "God bless you," in raised lettering all over the surface of it. And it was heavy. I mean, it weighed a good 75 to 100 pounds. And it was hollow, but of course, it's bronze is still like heavy. And the idea with it was something to do with blind faith, I was thinking about. And this idea of you can't eat art, but this idea of wanting to move forward with blind faith. And after that, I made a couple more smaller versions of it. The "God Bless You" potato is what I kind of nicknamed it. But that was when I first started doing it. And I remember a particular experience that was associated with it when in graduate school. At the end of the day, we'd go buy our bumper of beer at the local convenience store. And I remember opening up the door and hearing one of the workers sing a "God Bless You" song. And it had the lyrics of that in there. And then you shut it and then you wouldn't hear it anymore. And then you'd open it and you'd hear it. And I remember that being influential in some way. But that was the first time I used text with cast metal.
So I'm looking back at the questions here, and I think that we'll wait and see if at the end there are additional questions that are back specifically about your work, Patty.
Okay, sure.
We'll pass it along to James.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. Can everybody hear me just to make sure we good?
Yes.
All right. Always like to make sure of that. So, like Lisa said, I'm James Lukes. I am an assistant professor at Chatham University here in Pittsburgh. And so I'm going to get going here. So basically, I make work about what I know. And so this could sort of serve as an artist statement, right? These words, I use text a lot. Titles are really important to my work. But really, I'm talking about rural America, where I grew up, the American West, and sort of the myths and misconceptions around that. And so I think when we think about the West, especially where I'm from, South Dakota, Mount Rushmore, beautiful landscape, the myth of, the romantic trope of the cowboy, that's what's often associated with it. But I, really, especially in 2010, wanted to talk about what I knew as the actual history of the American West. So where I'm from, which is the Black Hills of South Dakota, I grew up in stolen land. So this land was taken from, the Sioux, and we just, because there was gold, never gave it back. And it's built these subdivisions. I didn't grow up in one of those, but in subdivisions all over, sort of in the West, built on violence. And so the West that I actually know is violence. It's a toxic area. It's a land of abandonment. It's a land of boom and bust. And addiction, is, quite prevalent. We talk about, opiate addiction, quite a bit over here. When I was growing up, it was a big thing in the West. And so that's what I make work about. And my practice is interdisciplinary, and I often use the most mundane objects and aestheticize them a bit. So this is just simply a magazine that I found extremely problematic, of a man with his gun surrounded by his wife and children. And so I thought it had this religious connotation. And so I will aestheticize, these objects often. So I put gold leaf on the frame. I take, really sort of mundane things like the cowboy figurine, use sort of this odd museum lighting. And I like the familiar aspect of these objects as a way to critique, because it is sort of something that I think is a little bit more universal. And we can, start to have a conversation about what the West is, which, is primarily, violence, and thinking about the myth of the cowboy. So I think that especially in American politics, you see it. I think that I was talking to somebody recently that, Trump was trying to be John Wayne and Biden's trying to be Gary Cooper. I think that all our politicians have that sort of cowboy mentality. And I really think that it's, affected how we, think, or, our society is shaped. And again, using these low objects and, sort of iconic things like baseball, or placing it next to, just a sign that I found that is obviously, somebody asking for change for a beer. Placing these objects next to one another to create, sort of that, critique. I also, often find myself just grabbing, things. This is a piece that I took, all the materials from abandoned work sites in a place called Bonner, Montana. All the stuff was just abandoned. It was a school they were going to build. All the stuff's abandoned. Again, aestheticizing, some of this, abandonment. In my two-dimensional practice, what I often do is use building materials, use these non-art materials, found objects, and build them up. And I view the material as content. In my work, everything that I do has to have a conceptual intent. And so I view the materials that I'm using as content. So in this piece, for instance, I'm using tar, I'm using roofing cement, and then I'm actually just grabbing, dead grass and putting in there. And I usually let almost all my 2D work sit outside my studio in the snow and the rain. But again, the material is content, and I'm trying to think of it as sort of like, again, abandonment, environmental degradation, pain, violence, decay, rot, all these things that I associate with where I grew up. It is, just kind of related into, not just sort of the materials content, but the process. I'm trying to do that. So the next slide, I actually have sort of a piece of how it sort of starts. So oftentimes, like with this last one, I'll be grabbing fabric, things like that, and I'll usually hand stitch, everything together. And so I'm cobbling together fabric, and canvas, and then, I'm just adding. It's an additive reductive process. And so, with that, I found that abstraction, really works in terms of materials content, but I've also been drawn to being very direct and using, again, the idea of the found, to really talk more directly. And I feel like collage, not only is it a great way to be really direct to talk about these things, and it's just another way for me to process my critique and comment of society, but it is, again, using things that we're very familiar with and things that I think, we, take for granted. So sort of the insidious effect that Amazon has. And, with my collages too, I don't try to do, or really, I don't do this with my work. I don't try to do like photo montage. I don't try to really hide anything. I try to make things relatively abject to where, here are just book covers and it's just, text, object. And so I want the viewer to sort of have to bring their own connotations into it and their own interpretations of these things, and not trying to add too much or, just sort of keeping things relatively simple to let the viewer interpret these things. And so, again, going back to sort of, the idea of myth and American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, and playing on nostalgia, I've also been investigating art history. So Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want, interspersed with a vacant lot where people have just, thrown, unusable things. And then again, wrapping things up with Manifest Destiny of Bierstadt's, the Hudson River School in general, just how that type of painting was sort of just seen as like, yes, this is, our right to take, or how the West is won, and trying to present a very simplified but more accurate depiction of what happened. And, lately I've also been thinking about, the future and thinking about climate change and the existential threat of it. And again, I'm trying to do it in a way that is, a little bit more simple. And so using things like this to where it's just, I think especially using, children with, sort of this gap in that glacier is a good way to, speak to those things. And so that's my info website, Instagram. It's easy. It's my name. And my studio is in Braddock at Unsmoke. So if anyone has questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. So.
So I'm going to just start by commenting that it's interesting. I've known both yours and Dietrich's work, but until I just saw them back to back, I never really noticed that way in which you're using the image of a child as a way to, create your work. And I know Dietrich uses some images of his own children. He's actually gotten pushback for it with the people thought that the tattooed baby was actually a tattooed baby, if you want to talk about that in a little bit. But James, the images of the children that you're using, are they necessarily people that you don't know, just sort of generic, or is it important that there's somebody specific?
I kind of like the idea that that it's a little bit more anonymous. I mean, especially with the nature of collage, I'm just sort of flipping through, and I think that I actually think it would be different if I was using, like childhood photos or something of me. I actually don't. I kind of feel that sort of the anonymous nature of just sort of me, plucking one of these and placing it in there. I think that it becomes a little bit more universal and not so much. I always try to avoid being too specific to where it almost becomes an inside joke. And so I like sort of that, anonymous nature of that.
All right. Thank you. And here is a question from Ronald Blevins. Do you feel any conflicting feelings about monetizing yourself as an artist and being anti-capitalist?
Yes. I think that there, succinctly, yes. I think that I was actually talking to some students in my class about this, and it's like, it's a real, like, I think, ethical sort of dilemma, because you want to, in order to, actually function within the art world, you have to embrace certain things that, you might, disagree with, that are antithetical to your, beliefs, or, what you're actually making. I always, point out, I think it's always interesting when, like art festivals and things like that are sponsored by, like, I remember one when I was an undergrad, it was sponsored by Wells Fargo. And I was like, this is so bad. And I was in the process of, like, they had that whole scandal of, like, where we were losing money and things like that. And I had that situation. But it's like, well, you want the show. And so I think that it's actually a really difficult thing to, I guess, navigate as an artist. And, also thinking about where, there are certain times when you make kinds of work that, it's not going to get into shows because other people are saying, like, oh no, we can't, show something like that. But yeah, that was a long rambling way, and I'd be interested to see if, anybody else had thoughts on that. But it's a long rambling way to say, like, yes, it's, something I think about quite a bit.
I kind of think that selling your work is a different relationship than like a corporate entity and their relationship to selling things. So a lot of times you have a personal connection with the person who is buying your work, or at least I find that people that are interested in purchasing want to have a connection with me. And instead of what is really the relationship when you buy something from a corporation, you have a brand relationship, or more brand identity kind of thing, and less of a personal relationship. So I kind of think of those as two different types of things, but it does become complicated when you need that corporate sponsorship in order to run a larger festival or a larger project.
Yeah, I find it really conflicted too. I mean, about 10 years ago, I had a period of a lot of commercial success where I was making a good amount of money on my work and showing my work largely to really wealthy people who I really had no interest in interacting with. And I was fortunate to be part of that Disneyland show with Banksy, and it kind of broke me a bit because it was so fulfilling, because it was not a show. I mean, it was a show to make all kinds of fame and money for Banksy. But other than that, for the artists that participated, it was really just art living a real life and interacting largely with people, meaning the people who came to Disneyland, who otherwise wouldn't be spending a lot of time thinking or looking at art. and it was really a vibrant place for art to exist, and much more vibrant than my white box gallery shows. And I'm sort of kind of ever since been a little bummed out because my other shows aren't that fulfilling, because they're got a fairly wealthy clientele, you know, and it's just a very insular environment. So I'm going to be seeking out more art environments where I can bring my art to people who either aren't expecting to see it, or just aren't from that sort of upper crust of the art world, because I'm sort of over that. And the beauty of being a professor is your main income is, you know, stable. So you don't need to rely on the sales of your work to kind of keep it running.
So I do not see any other questions. I'm just going to check in the chat and see if I missed anything there. Wait, I did miss some more questions. Here we go. The anonymous attendee writes this question: are most of your pieces about the West and its rich history representing your views or others? And I'm assuming this is for you, James.
I think initially, it all comes from sort of my experience and sort of, you know, and folks I know. But I think that there is, with a lot of the things that I'm talking about, there's a shared history, even though it's coming from sort of like I'm, you know, making, you know, obviously the decisions on what is actually going in there. But I think it is more of a, I would say it is reflective of, you know, sort of a larger consciousness. I think that, I think there's also, I mean, one of the things about the American West is that, you know, I think that I talk to people all the time about this, is like, I think it is very much flyover country. And I think about, you know, the fact that a lot of, especially within, you know, sort of political discussions, I think it's sort of like seen as like, well, you can't, you know, go in there. It's everybody's, you know, clinging to their guns and their Bibles. And it's like, well, I think that it's actually much more nuanced than that. And you have multiple views. It's not just sort of this monolithic, you know, thing with, you know, what the rural West is, or even rural America in general. And so I think that even though it comes from, you know, my work comes from the idea of like, yes, I'm making this as my, you know, idea. I think it is, you know, much more shared, and it's not just, you know, simply mine.
Thank you, James. And the
Um,
word.
I'd like to comment on that a little bit,
Okay, yeah.
about the West, because one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and was one of the kind of beginning points for some of the rope pieces that I was doing, was that I saw a show by Richard Prince where he had taken the Marlboro Man ads and taped them back together, and then taken a picture of them and blown them up very big as far for a show. And I was in the exhibition. I was thinking about, gosh, you know, this was my idea of masculinity growing up in the 70s, and kind of figuring out what to emulate, this idea of the cowboy. And it's a myth. Who really wants to be a cowboy? I mean, you're mostly alone and you're outside and it's cold and you have to cook your food over a fire. I mean, it sounds mythic and romantic in a certain way, but it really isn't. But at the same time, I had this notion of the cowboy growing up and being a kid in the 70s. And I was just thinking about, I have twin daughters who are teens, and like, what's their idea of masculinity? We don't have the Marlboro Man.
Yeah.
So what, you know, is it a celebrity? I'm not quite sure. Like that level of masculinity isn't present in the same way for kids now that it used to be. So I think it's rather interesting. I look at your work thinking about like the myth of the cowboy, and relate to these the really kind of cultural marketing notions than any like, I mean, based on reality or sourced from reality, but no longer a reality that's really present now.
Well, a very selective reality, though. I mean, I think of that image of masculinity also being wrapped up in these notions of bigger national notions of freedom and liberty, and it's like, for who is my first question, you know, or bringing the idea of bringing us back to the good old days. Okay, so was it great to be a woman back then? Was it, you know, great to, I mean, we could list all the people who it wasn't great for, right? It's the freedom and liberty was a pretty narrow selection of individuals and identity who got to experience that. And it's, you know, it's like looking at history with like total blinders on to sort of buy into what the old Westerns sort of sold. And I grew up in Texas, spending a lot of time in school on Texas history, and there was no mention of, you know, of Native Americans whatsoever. We spent most of our time on the Texas Revolution, which was the shortest revolution in history, you know, so ignoring everything else. So, I mean, we like to be very selective with our memories of where our national identities, you know, are and come from.
Dietrich, Melanie Lansell has a question for you. Does collaboration play a role in your practice as it progresses?
I wish it did more. I'm a little lost as an artist right now because I made the great mistake of trying to build a really awesome studio. And it's a process. I've been working on that process for the last 2 years. So all my art time is going into building a really amazing building. So I'm not sure what things look like moving forward, but I'm hoping that starting this summer, I'll be really cranking it, making art again.
Patty and James, either of you want to comment on the idea of collaboration in your practice?
For me, I think the most part, I do all the making. However, I would say where I source the text these days can have these collaborative elements to it. I've started kind of looking at different hashtags that I see, or different things that are going on people's Instagram. And I've started kind of pulling some words from there. So I think where I'm starting to source things is changing a little bit, or just maybe might be a little bit more collaborative. And then also, I am doing an actual word collaboration with a poet that's going to be coming up. So I'm kind of excited to cast other people's text at this point. That might be something new.
Yeah, I think for me, like collaboration's always been a part of the practice or my studio practice. Like I'm currently into collaborative projects through the mail. One is sort of an international thing with collage. The other is just, we're actually sending larger things. It's a friend of mine from undergrad, just back and forth through the mail, working on things, you know, toward a show. I've worked, and I kind of feel like in general, because everything pretty much that I use is borrowed in a way, it's like, again, I'm taking, everything's found. So in a way, I think either directly or indirectly, collaboration is a part of, my studio practice. So yeah.
Well, thank you all. We were initially intending to have 5 speakers, and so we're going to be ending a little bit shorter or a little bit earlier, but I want to invite you to rejoin us at 3 o'clock on the next, for the next conversation. We're going to start off at 3 o'clock. Patty Beachley, he's really heading up in many ways the planning for the next Sculptrex Symposium. Again, it's going to be this September in Pittsburgh and Greensburg. She'll be giving us some highlights at 3 o'clock, and you can follow the developing information about it on our website, sculptrex.org. And we also do have a Twitter handle that I totally forget, so it's available on the website. You can check it out. Any final words from our panelists today?
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.